Birds. They say here reptiles by another name because in some cladograms you can actually argue that birds should be classified as reptiles, but for our purposes, we're just going to stick with birds. These are all of the orders of birds. You will be happy to know that I am not going to require that you know them all because there are so many and they are very specific. However, I will require that you know what makes a bird a bird. And there are quite a few characteristics of birds that are necessary to know. External structures of birds, of course, include feathers. All feathers are not created the same. They serve a variety of functions, and of course, including flight. Also, insulation. Insulation is largely reserved for the down feathers. The down feathers are fluffy because they lack the little hooks that hook each of the individual little um, barbules together. So that they're not held rigid like the contour feathers, which look like this, are. Contour feathers are used for flight. They are also the feathers that you see. The down feathers are held underneath the contour feathers. Feathers are also used for courtship displays. They're used for incubation somewhat, but also the loss of feathers is actually used for incubation significantly more. They're also used for waterproofing. Formation of feathers occurs in a way that there's an eruption of the skin and it appears through the skin somewhat like a toothpick, and the sheath that appears starts to gradually flake away. What grows out, what starts to appear then and form are you start to see the barbs from the feather underneath. It's a very gradual process. External structure and locomotion of birds. Their skeleton is very lightweight and very strong because it does need to hold up to flight. It's made lightweight not by hollow bones, but by bones that have a thin matrix within them. They also do have reduced number of skull bones and teeth, which are actually quite heavy. I know you don't think of them that way, but they are, has been replaced by a bill. The bill and the flexible neck are used in nesting and feeding young because those are tight spaces and a lot of times you need to maneuver around in there. The pelvic girdle and vertebral column and ribs have been strengthened for flight. We also have something called a pygiostyle, which is the end of the vertebral column seen here. It's where the tail feathers would be attached. Flight muscles, what's attached? Those are attached to the sternum, which is here, and the keel in through here, and the furcula, which is what you would call a wishbone if you're used to pulling on that on Thanksgiving. For the appendages themselves, there's been fission of bones and also some perching tendons that are an addition. So perching tendons here. This is the matrix throughout the bones. They do have muscles, new, which have been adapted for flight. Flight, the way that it happens is an airfoil is formed. There's a greater surface area over the top of the wing than there is under the wing, and then because of that greater distance that's the air that's passing over it travels at different speeds, and that sucks the wing up. In order to reduce the turbulence as this happens, they have something called an alula, which is this little tiny outcropping here of the wing, and that disrupts the airflow a little and decreases the disturbance. Kinds of flight include gliding, which is traveling on air currents, but the travel is always downward. There's also flapping flight, where they're moving their wings up and down. Soaring flight, which is also traveling on air currents, but they're catching thermals and they're moving upwards. And hovering. Hovering is always been associated with hummingbirds, but it does occur in a much larger variety of species than just in the hummingbirds, including actually burrowing owls, which is one of the species that people find most surprising, I think. Nutritionally and digestively, one of the key things with birds is that they have a very high metabolic rate, and that's can be difficult to support. So they have to have very high rates of food consumption. In order to consume a lot of food, the bills have been modified. In the raptors, you find a hooked bill so that they can shred the food that they're eating. Here, in this flamingo, they're actually filtering food out of the water column. Cardinals are seed eaters, and actually relatively large seed eaters, so their bills are quite thick. Digestive tract includes a crop for storage, so if you find a lot of seed at one time, that can be consumed at once and saved. A proventriculus, which secretes gastric juices for digestion, and a ventriculus, which is actually more commonly called a gizzard, which is what grinds up food. Circulation, gas exchange, and temperature regulation. They have completely separated atria and ventricles, so it's very important that birds have completely separated respiration and circulatory system. Again, that really high metabolic rate demands separate systems. They also have very rapid heart rates, and those are, again, to support flight and endothermy. I hadn't mentioned it to this point, but birds are the first group that we've dealt with, which is actually endothermic. So they are supporting a constant body temperature metabolically. Gas exchange. Birds have a syrinx, which says a lot about their vocalization capabilities. That syrinx actually splits before it gets to the lungs, which is why the songbirds are capable of singing chords, more than one note at a time. Their bronchi lead to air sacs, which enhances their respiratory efficiency, and they have lungs, which are very small air tubes. Thermoregulation capabilities. Birds are maintaining body temperatures somewhere between 38 and 45 degrees Celsius. If you look at our body temperature, we're looking at about 37 degrees Celsius. So higher than us, of course. Their additional forms of heat conservation include fluffing the feathers to decrease heat loss, tucking their bill into their feathers. They can also generate heat by shivering, and muscular activity in flight. Nervous and sensory systems, their vision is quite good. It's double focusing. They can curve both their lens and the cornea to focus. Binocular versus monocular vision depends on the bird and what their needs are. So that difference is, are you going to focus? Are both eyes going to look at the same thing, or are they not? So if we look here at a pigeon, which is going to hunt seeds, each eye, most of it is looking at its own item. So the pale blue is its monocular field of view. So this eye is looking only over here, the other eye is looking only over here. What they can see together is just this dark blue triangle. So these birds are not, what you lose with monocular vision is depth of field. So you lose depth perception. If you are a predator, that depth perception is losing that depth perception would be a problem. So if we go to the hawk, their monocular vision is here, and here they have a much larger binocular vision, and that's needed. They need to be able to catch things. Woodcocks, they actually have a tiny bit of binocular vision behind their head and a little bit in front, but most of their vision is monocular. Olfaction. Most prominent in the vultures. Most birds do not smell well. And I don't mean that they don't stink. Means they can't smell things. Vultures can smell, and the primary reason for that is because they need it to find their food. Dead things stink, and that's what they need to eat. Hearing, however, is well developed for a variety of reasons. One, they use vocal communication. Excretion and osmoregulation. They excrete uric acid. It's stored in the cloaca. They, in that way, they can conserve water, and they were able to invade most terrestrial environments. The marine birds also have salt glands so that they can excrete excess salt. Reproduction and development. The testes, there are two. However, in the females, only the left ovary develops and releases an egg. Why? Because loss of the right ovary made them much lighter for flight. Makes a whole lot more sense. So releases the egg, introduces the semen, the sperm, fertilize, and then you lay down the shell, and then lay the egg. Territories in courtship are very common. It's very common for birds to guard a territory. It's very common for males to compete for females. Mating is diverse. Some species are monogamous, some polygynous, and even a couple polyandrous species. In this case, prairie chickens actually all display on a lek, which many males all congregate in a common lek for the population and compete for females. Nesting activities. Clutch sizes vary across species. Most of them incubate the eggs. There are a few species that are super precocial that don't. Altricial species versus precocial. So altricial eggs and offspring are entirely dependent on the parents at hatching. Precocial are relatively independent at hatching. They are somewhat mobile and can feed themselves a limited amount. They still need some care from their parents. Altricial individuals are completely immobile, blind, and completely unable to thermoregulate. There is a continuum between altricial and precocial. So here we have altricial nestlings on the left, which are actually quite developed, not anywhere near their hatch date, probably at least halfway through their nesting period, if not 2/3 of the way. And these are precocial species on the right. Migration and navigation. Migration are trips between breeding and non-breeding areas. Typically annual, typically north to south. Breeding area has resources and space availability that is not abundant in the non-breeding area. Some species only migrate if they have to. So in other words, great blue herons are an example. Great blue herons only leave this area if the waterways freeze up and they can't access fish. If it doesn't freeze, they don't leave. Or they wait until it freezes to leave. The Arctic tern is the king of the migrators. They basically migrate pole to pole. So northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere. The route that they follow, it depends. Some cases they're using landmarks. In some cases they're using compasses like sun or stars and magnetic cues from the earth.